Between the Civil War and 1900, the United States became the foremost industrial nation in the world. America produced more steel, iron, coal, oil, timber, gold, silver, and meat than anyone else. She led the world in miles of railroad and telegraph lines, and thanks to the inventions of Alexander Graham Bell and Thomas Edison, she had more telephones and electric lights than any other country. The era is commonly called the Gilded Age, which was the title of a novel that Mark Twain wrote about a shady politician and a crooked businessman. Like the dime store trophy, the exterior glistened brightly golden, but if one scratched through the paint, it was only cheap pot metal. Twain pointed out that under the surface of sensational economic development, American society had a scabby center of corruption and greed. Others had termed it the era of good stealing and called the business leaders robber barons, but Twain's phrase prevailed. Between Lincoln and Theodore Roosevelt, a succession of presidents, Andrew Johnson, U.S. Grant, Rutherford B. Hayes, James Garfield, Chester Arthur, Grover Cleveland, Benjamin Harrison, and William McKinley provided little leadership to the nation. Republicans and Democrats differed little on what were basic issues. Both parties supported protective tariffs and sound currency. Both were pro-business and used governmental power to break strikes. After the end of Reconstruction, civil rights for blacks were seldom mentioned, and with the rise of the Ku Klux Klan in the South and state control of voting rights, blacks were almost totally excluded from the polls. By the last decade of the 19th century, the voting turnout of blacks had dropped by 99%. Between 1882 and 1901, nearly 2,000 blacks were killed by lynching. Segregation laws, also known as Jim Crow laws, began to appear all over the South. Blacks were ordered to use separate restrooms, water fountains, restaurants, and hotels. In the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, handed down in 1896, the Supreme Court ruled that these separate facilities were legal as long as they were equal. Even though the facilities in the South were never equal, Jim Crow laws governed the South for decades to come. Corruption in government was rampant at all levels. The spoils system frustrated the efforts of well-meaning presidents to bring honesty and efficiency to the federal government. Many cities were run by the likes of New York's Boss Tweed with his ingenious ways to spend a budget. Some politicians sold valuable public assets while others gave it away. After losing a battle in the New York legislature, one frustrated businessman defined an honest legislator as one who stays bought. America looked to John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, and J.P. Morgan for leadership. These businessmen seemed to be the only true creative forces in the land. In a few short years, they transformed the society, linked the nation with railroads, built a marvelously efficient steel industry, opened oil fields, poured out a flood of new gadgets, and introduced a ruthless efficiency into production. These men preferred that government not interfere with their efforts, and America soon discovered that these businessmen had concentrated wealth and power beyond anything the nation had experienced before. The Gilded Age witnessed the assassination of President James Garfield in 1881 after serving only a few months in office. He was succeeded by Chester Arthur. President Grover Cleveland had the dubious honor of being the only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms, the latter of which was hampered by the Depression of 1893. The 1890s constituted a great watershed in American history. America before that time was predominantly agricultural. After that, predominantly urban and industrial. The America of the 19th century was primarily concerned with domestic problems, but in the 1890s she became involved in world affairs, and from then on was inextricably tied to the economy and politics of the entire globe. By 1890, the Civil War was no longer a cardinal issue in the political battle between the Democrats and the Republicans. Also in that year, an official report indicated that the frontier no longer existed in America, and the frontier had been an integral part of the American scene for decades. By the 1890s, the city had become a dominant feature of American life, and the millions of new immigrants coming to the country were from Southern and Catholic Europe rather than from the Western Protestant countries. The Gilded Age also saw the last major conflict between Indians and whites when federal troops opened fire upon 200 men, women, and children during the massacre at Wounded Knee in South Dakota. By the end of the 19th century, only 267,000 Native Americans remained in the United States.